Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The sun was lowering behind the ridge when Jonah Reddick rode into the yard. The last light of the day, settling across the dry valley in a pale, steady glow. His horse moved slowly, its breath showing in the cooling air, and Jonah felt the familiar ache in his shoulders from carrying traps all afternoon. He expected the usual quiet, the kind of stillness that always greeted him after days spent alone, but something in the ground near the cabin door stopped him before he even reached the hitch rail. There were tracks. Light, uneven, desperate. Jonah stayed in the saddle for a moment longer, forcing his heartbeat to settle. The prints were not made by a man. They were too narrow, too scattered, like someone stumbling and catching themselves. A smaller set followed close, tiny steps that pressed shallow into the dirt. He saw where knees had sunk into the ground, one deeper than the other, as if someone had lowered themselves slowly and stayed there for some time. Jonah swung off the horse, boots landing quiet. He held the reins loosely as he crouched, running 2 fingers along the edge of footprint. The shape told him enough. Apache woman, small child, exhausted, likely starving. He felt a pull deep in his chest, not fear, but concern heavy enough to make him breathe slower. The cabin door stood slightly open, just enough to catch his eye. That door never stayed open unless he left it that way, and Jonah always checked it twice before leaving. His hand found the butt of his holstered revolver automatically, though he didn't draw it. Not yet. He took one slow step toward the door. Another. Inside, the room was dim, the last bit of daylight slipping across the floorboards. The fire in the stove had died down to faint orange coals. At first, Jonah saw nothing. Then his eyes adjusted. A woman stood in the corner near the wall, her back partly turned, a child held tightly against her chest. Her clothes were torn, her shoulders shaking with exhaustion. She turned at the sound of his step, and Jonah caught the look in her eyes, fear that had been building for days, maybe weeks, held back only by the small weight of the child she protected. He froze, not out of fear, but so she wouldn't. The woman swallowed hard, her throat trembling. Her voice came out thin, rough from dryness. "Please, my daughter, she needs food." Her gaze didn't move from him. Her arms tightened around the girl, whose head rested limp against her shoulder. The child looked no older than 4. Jonah saw how shallow her breaths were, how close to faint she seemed. Maya, he didn't know her name yet, shifted her feet slightly, adjusting the girl's weight despite how unsteady her own legs were. "I can offer myself," she continued, barely audible, "if you feed her." Jonah felt something heavy settle inside him, a sharp awareness of how desperate she had become. He didn't step forward. He didn't reach out. He only lifted his left hand slightly, palm out, to show he meant no harm. "No," he said, voice steady, low, controlled. "Not that. Your girl eats. Both of you eat. That's all." He saw the confusion flicker across her face first, then disbelief. Fear didn't leave her, but it shifted, loosening just enough for her to take a breath that didn't shake as hard. Jonah walked toward the table slowly, keeping his distance as he placed what food he had from earlier, bread, a tin bowl of stew, half a boiled potato, onto the surface. The smell filled the room. The child stirred weakly, sensing warmth or food or both. "You can sit," Jonah said quietly. "Let her eat." Maya didn't move at first. Her mind was racing. He could see in the tension in her hands, the way she angled her body to keep the child shielded. She was deciding whether he was dangerous, whether she had made a mistake coming here. Jonah stepped back near the door, giving her space, letting her see every movement he made. Finally, she edged forward, lowering herself into the chair. Her knees nearly buckled as she did. When she placed the girl on her lap, her hands trembled so much she had to steady the child twice before lifting a tiny spoonful of stew. Onya opened her mouth slowly. A small sound left her throat, a faint whine, not quite a cry, not quite relief. Watching them, Jonah felt something inside him shift. He remembered the weight of silence after his wife's passing, the quiet that had seeped into this cabin for years. He remembered the sound of a child breathing, the sound of someone depending on him. He exhaled slowly and leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely so he didn't look threatening. His mind ran through questions. Where had she come from? Who hurt her? Were they nearby? But he pushed them aside for now. The first priority was simple. Let them breathe, let them eat, let them be safe for at least one night. Maya fed the girl in tiny bites, watching Jonah with cautious eyes the whole time. Every movement she made was careful, as if ready to run if he so much as stiffened. Jonah stayed still. He didn't rush her. He didn't speak again until the bowl was nearly empty. "You'll take the bed tonight," he said, keeping his voice even. Her eyes widened slightly, unsure how to react. "I'll sleep by the stove," he added. "It's warmer there anyway." Something flickered in her expression, a mix of confusion, fear, and a small, buried relief that she wasn't ready to trust yet. But she didn't refuse. She didn't argue. She only pulled her daughter closer and nodded once. Jonah turned toward the stove, adding 2 logs and adjusting the vent so the room slowly warmed. As he worked, he found himself listening to the sound of Maya's breathing, steadying with each passing moment. He hadn't expected to come home to anyone. He hadn't expected to feel anything stir inside him again. But tonight, someone else breathed under his roof. And Jonah knew, as he sat near the stove and watched the fire catch, that nothing in this cabin would feel the same from now on. The fire in the stove burned low but steady, the orange glow spreading slowly across the floorboards as Jonah eased himself down near it. He didn't lie back yet. He kept his eyes open, listening to the soft, uneven breaths coming from the bed. Maya sat on the edge with her daughter cradled against her chest, her posture stiff, as if any shift might wake danger instead of comfort. Jonah kept his hands loosely resting on his knees, showing no sign of hurry, no sudden movements. He understood enough to know she was deciding whether he was safe. He had seen that look before on people who had run too far, too long. "You can sleep," he said, voice low, steady. "Doors locked. No one will come in." Maya didn't answer at first. Her head tilted slightly, studying him in the dim firelight. Her eyes reflected exhaustion, so deep it looked like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. Her shoulders were drawn tight beneath her torn dress, and she held Onya with both arms, as if even the softness of a blanket might not be enough protection. Finally, she spoke, quiet, strained. "Why are you helping us?" Jonah's jaw tightened, and he took a slow breath before answering. "Your girl needs rest. Food. Warmth. That's reason enough." Maya lowered her gaze, as if unsure how to process an answer without hidden conditions. She rocked her daughter gently, and the movement was so careful that Jonah felt a tightening in his chest. He could see how fragile her strength was, barely holding, but still holding all the same. He looked away to give her space. "I'm not going to take anything from you," Jonah said after a moment. "I meant what I said." Maya's fingers stroked her daughter's hair. "Men don't help for nothing," she whispered, the words flat, shaped by experience more than belief. Jonah didn't respond right away. He understood the weight behind her words, the history that shaped them. He shifted his position on the floor, stretching one leg out as if settling for the night, showing her he had no interest in moving closer. "You won't hear that from me," he said finally. The wind pushed lightly against the cabin walls, the boards creaking in familiar ways. Jonah watched the fire brighten as fresh logs caught, and the warmth gently filled the small room, softening the sharpness of the cold. After a long silence, Maya finally moved to lie down on the bed. She didn't fully stretch out. She kept her knees drawn slightly inward, her daughter nestled against her stomach. Jonah noticed she slept on the far side of the bed, facing the wall, positioning herself so she could shield the child with her body. Her breathing shifted, still tense but slowing. Jonah lowered himself onto the old blanket near the stove, the floorboards cold beneath his shoulder, even through the fabric. He'd slept worse places. He lay still, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the small sounds inside the cabin. The gentle hum of the fire, the soft whimper of a child shifting in sleep, the faint rustle of Maya adjusting the blanket to cover both of them. He felt something unfamiliar stir, an awareness that the cabin no longer felt as empty as usual. He wasn't sure yet if that feeling was good or dangerous, but it was there, settling quietly in the back of his mind. Minutes passed before Maya spoke again, her voice slightly muffled by the blanket. "What is your name?" Jonah looked toward the bed, though he couldn't see her clearly in the dim light. "Jonah Reddick." Another small silence stretched. "I'm Maya," she whispered. "My daughter is Onya." He nodded once, even though she couldn't see it. "Rest, Maya. You're safe here tonight." She didn't answer, but he heard her exhale, one long, controlled breath that told him she had let go of a small piece of her fear, just for now. Jonah closed his eyes. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing clearly. He didn't regret opening the door. Dawn came slowly over the valley, pale light leaking through the small cabin window and landing in soft bars across the floor. Jonah woke before the sun fully rose, the habit ingrained deep from years of routine. His back ached slightly from sleeping on the floor, but he pushed himself up quietly, careful not to make sudden noise. The first thing he checked was the bed. Maya hadn't moved much. She lay curled around her daughter, one arm tucked protectively around the child's waist. Onya's small hand rested against her mother's collarbone, fingers gently curled. Both were still asleep, their breaths slow and steady. For the first time since they'd stepped into his cabin, Maya's face didn't look caught between fear and exhaustion. The tension around her eyes had softened in sleep. Jonah stood there for a moment longer than he intended, watching them with a slow breath he didn't fully understand. Something about the sight settled into him, steady and quiet. He stepped outside to fetch water before either of them woke. The cold air hit him immediately. Frost clung to the grass and the edges of the bucket by the well. His boots crunched softly in the thin layer of ice as he pumped water into the bucket. The familiar motions grounded him. Work always did. Out here, work meant control, routine, something he knew how to manage. But he kept thinking about the woman and child inside his cabin. How thin the child's wrists looked. How Maya's voice had cracked from strain. How she watched him like someone who had been hunted. Jonah carried the water back inside. The cabin was still quiet. He set the bucket by the door and stepped toward the stove to start a small fire. The match struck with a snap, and the flame caught the wood in slow, steady licks until warmth spread again through the narrow room. Only then did Maya begin to stir. Her eyes opened sharply at first. Instinct, not surprise. Then she relaxed when she saw Jonah standing near the stove and the door still locked. She checked her daughter next, smoothing a hand over the child's hair. Onya blinked at the light, her small face less sunken than the night before. Jonah kept his voice calm. "There's water if you want to wash. Food will be ready soon." Maya pushed herself upright slowly, her muscles stiff from sleeping in a tense position. She held her daughter close, as if unsure whether it was safe to step away. Jonah noticed the hesitation. "You can use the wash basin," he added. "I'll step outside. Take your time." She looked at him for a moment, trying to read him. Her eyes weren't as sharp as the day before, but cautious all the same. When Jonah moved toward the door, she finally nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jonah stepped outside, closing the door behind him. He stood on the small porch, watching the frost begin to melt under the rising sun. He rubbed his hands together, partly for warmth, partly because he wasn't sure what else to do with the strange sensation of someone else inside his home. After several minutes, he heard the door creak open behind him. Maya stepped outside with Onya on her hip, her long hair damp and pushed back from her face. She had wrapped herself in one of Jonah's blankets while her dress hung near the stove to dry. Her skin looked scrubbed clean, though the bruises on her wrists and arms stood out darker now. Jonah noticed her posture first, still guarded, but no longer looking for the fastest way to escape. Onya reached a sleepy hand toward Jonah's coat, curiosity replacing the weakness that had nearly overtaken her last night. Jonah watched her, a faint tug tightening in his chest. "She seems stronger," he said quietly. Maya nodded, brushing a loose strand of hair from her daughter's face. "She hasn't had enough to eat for days. She's been slipping in and out." Jonah's stomach tightened at the thought. "I'll make something warm," he said. Go on inside. It's cold out here. Maya hesitated before stepping past him, her eyes lingering on his for a brief moment. She didn't look away out of fear this time. She looked away as if adjusting to the feeling of letting someone help. Inside, Jonah placed a small pot on the stove and stirred together what he had: oats, a bit of dried fruit, water enough to soften it. The room warmed, filling with a smell far quieter than last night's stew, but comforting all the same. As he stirred, Maya sat at the table with her daughter on her lap. The morning light through the window softened the angles of her face. She ran her fingers gently over her daughter's back, her shoulders finally easing a little now that she wasn't holding herself upright through sheer will. Jonah set a bowl in front of her. "Eat slowly," he said, "for both of you." Maya lifted the first spoonful with steady hands, watching Anya swallow. The girl blinked, then reached for more, her strength returning bit by bit. Jonah leaned against the counter, watching them without crowding, without speaking unless needed. After a moment, Maya looked up at him. "You fix the door," she said softly, noticing the reinforced latch. Jonah shrugged lightly. Didn't want cold coming in, but that wasn't the real reason. She seemed to understand anyway. Her eyes lowered again, softer now. "Thank you, Jonah." He felt the weight of hearing his name from her. Careful, grateful, cautious, but no longer afraid. For the first time in a long while, the cabin didn't feel like a place meant for one person. It didn't feel empty. And Jonah knew as he watched them eat that whatever story had started at his door last night was far from finished. The sun climbed slowly over the valley, casting long strips of pale light across the yard, and Jonah felt the day settling into its usual rhythm. Only now the rhythm wasn't just his. The air carried the cold bite of late autumn, sharp enough to sting the fingertips. He stepped outside with an armful of tools, planning to split wood and check the fence line before the weather turned worse. Behind him, the cabin door opened with a faint squeak. Maya stepped out cautiously, holding Anya close against her hip. Jonah didn't turn immediately. He didn't want her to feel watched or pressured, but he spoke over his shoulder so she'd know she wasn't intruding. "You can stay inside where it's warm. No need to come out in the cold." Maya hesitated. He could hear it in the small pause before she answered. "I want to help," she said. Jonah finally turned. She stood wrapped in the blanket he had given her, her repaired dress still drying near the stove inside. Her breath clouded faintly in front of her as she shifted her daughter's weight. Anya's small hands clung to her mother's collar, but the child's eyes were brighter today, less sunken. "You don't know work for staying," Jonah said. Maya's expression tightened. "I need to do something. Sitting makes me feel." She didn't finish the sentence, but Jonah understood. Doing nothing meant waiting for harm. Standing still meant waiting to be caught. He nodded toward the woodpile. "If you want, you can bring kindling inside. Only if you feel steady enough." Maya gave a small nod, relief flickering through her posture. She adjusted her grip on Anya and walked carefully toward the pile of dried wood stacked beside the cabin. Jonah watched her movements, noticing the stiffness in her ribs, the way she avoided bending too far. She picked through smaller pieces and began arranging them in a small bundle with slow, controlled movements. Jonah turned back to his work. He set a log upright and swung the axe down in a straight, practiced arc. The wood split cleanly. He prepared another, repeating the motion with steady force. The familiar rhythm grounded him. Each swing was measured, efficient, the kind of effort that required focus but not thought. Between strikes, he glanced toward Maya. She knelt near the pile now, sorting pieces by size, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders each time the wind brushed past. Anya watched Jonah from her mother's hip with quiet curiosity, her eyes tracking each swing of the axe. It struck Jonah in an unexpected way. He had grown used to doing everything unseen. When the bundle was full, Maya stood slowly, balancing the child in the wood. Jonah stepped forward without thinking. "I can take that," he said. She stiffened at first, reflexive tension tightening her grip, but then she let him take the bundle. Her hands brushed his for only a second, cold, thin, trembling, but Jonah felt the small contact settle into him more than he expected. Inside the cabin, Jonah set the wood near the stove while Maya placed Onya on the bed. She looked around for something else to do. He saw it immediately, the need to anchor herself in the space, to feel like she had a place in it. "There's a broom by the door," he said, "if you want to tidy up." Maya nodded slightly. "I can do that." She swept slowly, careful with each movement, pausing when her ribs pulled too sharply. Jonah didn't comment on it. He didn't rush her. He let her move at her own pace. Her daughter watched from the bed, small fingers playing with the wooden horse Jonah had carved years ago. The room filled with the simple sounds of a home, wood being swept, fire crackling, tools shifting as Jonah checked hinges and rifle parts. The silence wasn't empty. It held purpose. It held breathing room. After a while, Maya sat by the stove and began mending her dress. Jonah noticed how she stitched with short, precise movements, threading slowly through torn seams. Her fingers shook from fatigue, not lack of skill. "You worked with thread before," Jonah said, glancing at her briefly. She nodded, eyes on her work. "I fixed clothing in my village, mostly for women who didn't have time." She paused, the needle hovering. "I liked doing it. It felt useful." Jonah adjusted a hinge, testing its tension. "It still is." She didn't answer right away, but her shoulders eased slightly, a small shift, almost unnoticeable unless someone was looking for it. Jonah found himself noticing everything. Later, when Jonah stepped outside to check the corral, Maya followed him with Onya on her hip. She didn't come close, just stood near the porch, watching him tighten a loose rail. The wind tugged at her hair, scattering a few strands across her face. She brushed them back and tucked them behind her ear with a slow, tired motion. Jonah tightened the last nail and looked up. Their eyes met across the short distance. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Maya glanced down, a small breath leaving her chest. Jonah saw what it meant. Not fear, not discomfort, but the beginning of trust. A fragile thing, still forming, but present in the way she didn't turn away immediately. When they returned inside, the child reached for Jonah again, small arms lifting slightly toward him. Maya froze, watching, unsure what would happen. Jonah waited a moment, then extended a steady hand. He touched Onya's tiny fingers carefully, as if handling something breakable. The girl made a soft sound, half laugh, half curious hum. Maya's lips parted, surprise flickering through her. Something warm and uncertain showed in her face. Jonah stepped back a moment later, giving them space. But the moment stayed in the room, settling into the quiet around them. By evening, the stove burned bright, the floor was swept, the woodpile stocked, and the small cabin felt different, lived in, balanced, shared. The silence between Jonah and Maya held no tension now. It held something steadier, something that neither of them had expected when the door first opened. It felt like the start of belonging, though neither dared name it yet. By late afternoon, the valley had cooled again, the kind of cold that settled low to the ground and crept into the spaces between boards. Jonah stood at the workbench near the window, shaping a piece of wood for a new drawer handle. The steady scrape of the file against the grain filled the small cabin with a soft, predictable rhythm. Maya moved around the room with slow care, her steps measured, her body still recovering. She had placed Onya on the bed with a folded blanket and a wooden horse to keep her company, and now stood near the stove preparing a simple stew, boiled potatoes, leftover meat, dried herbs Jonah kept in a small tin. Her movements were quiet, deliberate. She worked as though expecting permission to be revoked at any moment. Jonah watched her from the corner of his eye. Not intrusively, just enough to understand how she was doing. She reached for the pot on the top shelf of the stove and stretched slightly, her ribs pulling at the movement. He saw the wince before she tried to hide it. "You shouldn't reach for that," Jonah said, stepping forward. "Let me get it." Maya froze, her hand still half extended toward the shelf. She didn't pull back immediately, but she didn't accept his help right away either. Her breath hitched in a small, nearly invisible way, her instinct clearly telling her to stand her ground while her body told her she was already past her limit. Jonah didn't move closer until she nodded, small, hesitant, restrained. He lifted the pot, down carefully, placing it within her reach on the table. Their bodies were close enough that she could feel the warmth from him. But Jonah stepped back as soon as the pot was set down, giving her space again. "Thank you," she murmured, eyes lowering. The words weren't casual. They carried weight. He heard it. Jonah returned to his work, but his hands moved slower now. His thoughts stayed on the brief moment of closeness, the way she didn't recoil, the way her eyes softened before she looked away. As the stew warmed, the scent filled the room. Onya stirred on the bed, lifting her head and blinking at the smell. Maya moved to her immediately, touching her back and checking her temperature with the inside of her wrist. Jonah watched that too. He admired the small, instinctive gesture she made, protective, careful, grounding herself through her daughter. "She's stronger," Jonah said. Maya nodded, brushing her daughter's cheek with her thumb. "Because of the food and the warmth. And because you kept her alive all the way here," Jonah added. She hesitated at that. Compliments confused her. They didn't fit into the world she had lived in lately. As the stew finished, Maya ladled some into bowls. She handed Jonah his serving with both hands, a gesture that showed respect. Not servitude, not fear, but something steadier. He accepted it without brushing her fingers, careful as always not to make her feel cornered. They sat at the table across from each other. The lantern's light cast a soft glow on the wooden surface, shadows moving slightly each time the fire shifted. Jonah ate quietly, glancing at Maya occasionally as she gently fed small bites to her daughter. Onya chewed slowly, her eyelids drooping, the warmth of the room relaxing her into near sleep. "You don't have to do all this," Jonah said after a while. Maya stiffened slightly, unsure if he meant the cooking or the cleaning or something else entirely. He clarified, "You're still recovering. Rest if you need to." Maya lowered her gaze to her bowl. "Doing nothing makes me remember things," she said quietly. "Working helps." Jonah understood that more than she knew. "Then work," he said gently. "Just don't push yourself past what your body can take." A long silence followed, but it wasn't sharp. It held consideration, a small bit of trust settling into place. After supper, Jonah stood by the door, checking the latch again. He tightened the hinge he'd reinforced the day before, testing the way it caught. Maya noticed the attention he gave the door, and for the first time, she asked a question without fear behind it. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Jonah shook his head. "No, just making sure it won't rattle with the wind tonight." Then, after a pause, "You'll sleep easier if it stays shut solid." Maya looked at the door, her expression shifting in a way Jonah couldn't fully read. Relief, maybe. Gratitude. Something quieter, too. Recognition that he was thinking about her safety even without being asked. She stepped closer to the bed, lowering her daughter onto the pillow. Onya curled up instantly, pulling the blanket around herself with small, tired movements. Maya watched her daughter settle, then glanced toward Jonah. She hesitated, then spoke softly. "You fixed my dress." Jonah wiped his hand with a cloth, nodding once. "It needed fixing." "It was kind," she said. "I didn't expect kindness." He didn't know how to respond to that. Not in words. So he met her eyes for a moment, steady, quiet, letting her see that he meant everything he'd done, nothing more and nothing less. The stove crackled. The wind outside pressed gently against the cabin walls. The room held a quiet sense of safety. Maya sat on the edge of the bed, watching Jonah as he spread his blanket near the stove again. She seemed unsure if she was allowed to say more, to feel more, to settle into what this place was slowly becoming for her. Jonah spoke before she could retreat back into silence. "You and your daughter, you don't trouble me," he said. "You need a place to stay. This is it." Maya lowered her head, and Jonah saw her swallow hard, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The trust between them had grown another inch that day. Quiet, small, but undeniable. Morning came with a thin layer of frost clinging to the grass outside, the kind that made every step crunch faintly underfoot. Jonah had been awake before the first streak of light, pulling on his coat and stepping into the cold air to check the corral. His horse stood quietly, steam rising from its muzzle, and he brushed a hand along its neck before scanning the open valley. Tracks from the night, mostly animals. Nothing that suggested danger. Still, Jonah walked the fence line, tightening a loose strand of wire and checking the post for weakness. He didn't like surprises. Not anymore. When he returned to the cabin, he paused before entering. He heard soft movement inside. Maya's footsteps, the gentle shift of fabric, her voice whispering something to Onya. The sounds were faint but warm, different from the tense sounds of the first night. He pushed open the door slowly. Maya was sitting near the stove with Onya in her lap, brushing the child's hair with careful, slow strokes. Her own hair had been combed and braided loosely, falling over her shoulder in a dark, smooth line. Her repaired dress hung neatly on her body now that it had dried fully. The seams Jonah had stitched visible in straight, sturdy lines. When she looked up, her eyes didn't widen in alarm this time. They simply met his. "You were up early," she said. Her voice still carried caution, but it held something steadier too. "Habit," Jonah replied as he hung his coat. Weather might turn soon. Wanted to be sure the corral was holding. Maya nodded, shifting Onya slightly on her lap. The child looked stronger today, color returning to her cheeks, breath deeper, eyes more alert. She reached a small hand toward Jonah, not quite asking to be picked up, but acknowledging him. It caught Jonah off guard for half a second. Children had once been part of his life. Their small noises, their trust, their needs. Seeing a child reach for him again stirred something he hadn't felt in years, something both warm and painful. He stepped closer and let Onya touch the rough fabric of his sleeve. She patted it twice, curious. Maya watched the interaction closely, her body tense at first. When Jonah didn't move to take the child or crowd them, her shoulders eased again. "I slept," she said quietly. "Really slept." Jonah paused, turning toward her. "Good. It has been a long time," she added. Her gaze lowered to her daughter's hair. "I didn't wake thinking someone would drag me away. I didn't wake to shouting or footsteps or—" Her voice thinned. She stopped herself. Jonah didn't ask her to continue. He didn't push for details. Instead, he crouched near the stove to check the fire, adding a small log and adjusting the vent. His presence was steady, close enough for support, far enough not to pressure her. After a moment, Maya spoke again, her tone softer. "I know you don't want questions," she said, "and I don't want to speak about everything yet. But I want you to know, I didn't come here to cause trouble." Jonah looked up at her from where he crouched, the warm light of the fire catching the edges of her face. "You didn't bring trouble. You brought your daughter. That's different." Maya's lips parted slightly, as if surprised by the simplicity of his answer. He stood, brushing sawdust from his palms. Maya lifted Onya from her lap and helped her stand on the floor. The girl wobbled at first, then steadied, gripping the edge of the bed. Maya kept a hand lightly on her back. "She's stronger each day," Jonas said. "Yes," Maya replied, her expression softening. "Thank you." Jonah nodded toward the stew pot from last night. "There's some left. I can warm it if you want." Maya shook her head. "I can do it." She moved toward the stove with deliberate steps, balancing her daughter's weight and her own soreness from days of running. Jonah watched as she adjusted the pot on the grate, her fingers steady but delicate. The neckline of her repaired dress shifted slightly as she leaned forward, revealing a faint bruise along her collarbone. Jonah looked away quickly, not wanting her to think he was staring. But Maya noticed. Her eyes flicked toward him, just a brief glance, and for a moment, neither of them moved. She didn't pull the blanket tighter. She didn't turn her body away. She simply recognized the moment for what it was. Jonah, try not to make her uncomfortable. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "I don't mind if you look," she said, not boldly, not invitingly, just honest. "I just don't want to be scared anymore." Jonah inhaled slowly, steadying himself before answering. "I'm not here to take anything from you." "I know," she said. The confidence in those two words wasn't strong, but it was real. A small silence settled between them again. Not tense, not uncertain, just quiet understanding. Jonah rolled up his sleeves and checked his tools on the table. Maya stirred the warm stew. Onya toddled a few small steps along the edge of the bed, gripping the blanket to keep steady. The cabin felt lived in. Shared. When breakfast was ready, Jonas set plates on the table. Maya sat across from him with her daughter on her knee. They ate without hurry, without strain. Every small movement felt like another inch of trust settling into place. As they finished the meal, Jonas stood and walked to the door. "I'll check the ridge after this," he said. "Make sure no one's close." Maya straightened slightly, alert. "Do you think someone might be?" Jonah met her eyes with a calm that came from experience, not dismissal. "I always check. It's how I keep this place safe." Maya absorbed his words, then nodded. All right. She understood something then. That Jonah wasn't just a man living alone. He was someone who knew how to stay alive, how to keep others alive. When Jonah reached for his coat, Maya surprised herself, and him, with what she said next. "Be careful." He looked at her, truly looked, and saw sincerity in her expression. Concern. Something deeper forming beneath her guarded surface. "I will," he said quietly. He stepped outside, closing the door gently behind him. Inside the cabin, Maya held her daughter close and exhaled slowly. Not in fear, but in something new. She felt safe enough to wait for him to return. By mid-afternoon, clouds gathered low over the valley, thick and gray, flattening the distant ridge into a single dull line. Jonah could smell the shift in the air, snow coming soon, maybe by nightfall. He worked steadily, tightening the last hinge on the back door and testing it twice before stepping inside. Maya stood near the table, slicing vegetables with a small knife Jonah rarely used. Her movements were more confident today, more sure of her balance, though every now and then a tight pull around her ribs reminded her she wasn't fully healed. Onya sat on the floor beside her, tapping Jonah's old horse carving gently against the boards. Jonah noticed the slight grimace on Maya's face as she reached up to place the knife back on the shelf. It was the same pain he had seen yesterday, sharp, sudden, then hidden. "You shouldn't reach for that," Jonas said, setting his tool down. "Let me." Maya stopped mid-stretch, caught between pride and practicality. She didn't like needing help, and Jonah could see the hesitation in her eyes. But after a moment, she lowered her hand and stepped back. Jonah retrieved the knife and set it safely on the table. Their faces ended up close for a brief second, the space between them narrowing naturally. Maya didn't step away. Jonah didn't linger. The moment passed quietly, but left something behind, an awareness neither of them tried to hide. "Thank you," she said, her voice low, calmer than the day before. Jonah nodded once and moved to the stove where he stirred the pot she had prepared. The scent of cooking vegetables and broth filled the small room. A simple meal, but warm enough to feel like the beginning of routine. Maya watched him work, her expression softening in a way Jonah rarely saw. Not admiration, not discomfort, something steadier, relief, perhaps, or the quiet recognition of someone who didn't ask for more than she could give. After a moment, she spoke. "You fix things without being asked," she said quietly. "Doors, hinges, this place." Jonah shrugged lightly as he stirred. "Cabin needs upkeep. Cold gets in otherwise." "That's not what I mean," Maya said, her voice dropping. Jonah paused, the ladle still in the pot. He turned toward her slowly. She looked down at Onya, smoothing a hand over her daughter's hair. "You fix things when you see they're broken, even when no one asks." Jonah swallowed once, not expecting the weight of the words. He worked his jaw before replying. "Sometimes it's easier to fix things than to leave them as they are." Maya lifted her gaze. "You're good at it." Jonah didn't know how to absorb a compliment anymore. He cleared his throat, returning to the stove. "Food will be ready soon," he said quietly. A soft knock of wood pulled their attention. Onya had managed to stand using the corner of the bed for support. She wobbled, then steadied, her small legs stronger than they'd been since arriving. Jonah stepped toward her instinctively, hands ready in case she toppled. Maya watched closely, waiting to see how he'd respond. Onya reached toward Jonah, hand opening and closing in an unmistakable request. Jonah crouched slowly, giving her time to reconsider. When she didn't, he lifted her with steady hands. Onya settled against his shoulder, tiny fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt as though she belonged there. Maya froze. She hadn't realized how strange and tender the sight would be, her daughter resting on a stranger's shoulder without fear. Jonah's hand supported the girl's back, careful and sure. The child's breath warmed the side of his neck, and Jonah exhaled quietly, adjusting to the familiar but long-absent feeling of holding a small body close. "She trusts you," Maya whispered, almost to herself. Jonah looked at her, something unspoken moving between them. "She trusts who's gentle," he replied. Maya blinked, her throat tightening slightly. No one had said something like that to her in years. Jonah carried the girl as he set bowls on the table. Maya stepped forward to help, brushing against Jonah's arm for just a second. Neither apologized. Neither stepped away. They ate together, Maya and Jonah across from one another, Onya on Jonah's knee this time, lifting spoonfuls to her own mouth with clumsy concentration. Each small gesture, the sharing of food, the quiet glances, the steady warmth of the stove, wove them into something that resembled a family, even if no one dared call it that yet. As dusk deepened outside, Jonah lit the lamp. The yellow glow softened the room, casting warm light across Maya's face as she cleaned the bowls. Jonah stood near the door, checking the lock again, an unspoken promise repeated through action. Maya dried her hands on a cloth and watched him. "You're always checking," she said gently. Jonah's eyes remained on the latch. "Habit keeps everyone safe." Maya stepped closer, close enough that Jonah could feel the warmth of her body near his side, close enough for her voice to drop into something more private. "Thank you for letting us be here," she said, "and for not asking questions I'm not ready to answer." Jonah looked down at her, truly seeing the woman behind the exhaustion, resilient, wary, determined. She had carried herself through hunger and fear, yet here she stood, trusting him more each day. He nodded, his voice rougher than before. "When you're ready, you'll tell me what you want to tell. Until then, this is your place too." Maya inhaled slowly, her eyes softening in a way Jonah felt more than he understood. The wind pressed against the cabin, but inside the room, the silence held warmth. Not the fragile kind from their first night, but something sturdier. Something earned. Something growing. Jonah met her gaze one last time before banking the fire for the night. Maya didn't look away. The bond between them was no longer forming. It was already there, plain and undeniable. Night settled early over the valley, the kind of night that made sound carry clearly across open ground. Jonah closed the shutters one by one, checking each latch, then moved to the stove to add a final piece of wood. The fire inside caught slowly, brightening the room with a warm, steady glow. Maya sat at the table, sewing one of Onya's small leather ties back onto her dress. Her movements were careful and controlled, the needle held between fingers that still shook now and then. Onya slept on the bed under a folded blanket, breathing quietly, her small chest rising and falling with a rhythm far stronger than the day she arrived. Jonah watched them for a moment before turning back to his work. He sat at the opposite side of the table, carving a new toy horse from a block of softwood. Each stroke of his knife was slow and deliberate. The sound, steady scraping along the grain, blended with the faint crackle from a stove. Neither spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It had weight, warmth, and the comfort of routine forming between two people who barely knew each other but no longer felt like strangers. Maya's needle slipped suddenly, pricking her finger. She flinched, a sharp breath escaping. Jonah set his carving down immediately. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, but her hand trembled. A small bead of blood gathered at her fingertip. Jonah reached across the table slowly, giving her enough time to pull back if she felt threatened. She didn't. Her gaze followed his hand as though she was still deciding whether to trust the moment. He took her hand gently, turning it palm up. His thumb brushed lightly against her knuckle as he lifted her finger. The touch was warm, cautious, respectful, soft in a way Jonah hadn't used in years. "It's a small cut," he said, keeping his voice low. "Just stings." Maya watched him as he wiped the spot with a cloth, her chest rising in a shaky breath. She didn't pull her hand away. Her eyes shifted between his fingers and his face, searching for any sign of demand, expectation, harm. There was none. Her voice came out quiet, barely more than a whisper. I didn't expect someone to be gentle. Jonah swallowed once, the word striking deeper than she intended. You deserve gentleness, he said. The sentence came out rough, unpolished, but real. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes softened, the guarded tension slipping for the first time since she arrived. Jonah realized he was still holding her hand. He released her slowly, letting her decide whether the moment ended or continued. It didn't end. Maya reached across the table again. Not for the sewing needle, not for the cloth, for him. Her fingers brushed the back of his hand in a quiet, deliberate touch. It wasn't bold. It wasn't fearful. It was acknowledgement. Connection. Jonah held still, letting her take the lead for once. When her fingers lingered, he turned his hand just enough for their palms to meet. His callous skin pressed lightly against her softer, colder one. The fire crackled. The room stayed quiet. Maya breathed in, slow and careful. When she finally stood, Jonah rose too, without thinking. They met near the stove, only a few inches apart. Maya tilted her chin up, searching his face, not with fear but with a careful, emerging trust. Jonah's heart thudded once, heavy, certain. He raised a hand toward her face, moving slow enough for her to step back if she wanted to. She didn't. She leaned slightly into his touch, her cheek resting against his palm. Her voice trembled in the quiet. I don't know what's happening, but I'm not afraid. Jonah brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lightly grazing her skin. You don't have to be. The space between them closed naturally. Jonah lowered his forehead to hers, feeling her breath steady as she exhaled. She lifted her hand to his chest, the fabric of his shirt bunching between her fingers. Their lips met, slow at first, hesitant, both of them careful not to cross any line the other didn't set. The kiss wasn't fierce or rushed. It was steady, grounding, the kind of touch that asked rather than took. Maya's hand slid up slightly, finding his shoulder. Jonah's other hand settled at her waist, light but secure, respecting every inch of her boundary. They pulled apart gradually, their breaths mingling in the warm air. Maya looked up at him, cheeks flushed, voice quiet but steady. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe enough to do that again. Jonah's reply was soft. You're safe here. She leaned her forehead back against his chest, just for a moment, breathing in his steady presence. Jonah closed his eyes briefly, letting himself experience the weight of her trust, a weight he would protect without question. Their moment wasn't loud or dramatic. It lived in small breaths, slow touches, and the quiet understanding that something real had begun. On the bed, Onya shifted in sleep. The fire warmed the room, and for the first time in years, Jonah felt something he thought he had lost forever. The sense of being needed, and the sense of wanting to stay. The next few days slipped into a quiet routine that felt natural in a way Jonah hadn't expected. Each morning he stepped outside to check the ridge, the corral, the animal tracks in the valley. Each time he returned, Maya was awake, brushing her daughter's hair or preparing something simple on the stove. Onya's strength improved steadily, her cheeks filling out, her voice growing louder in small hums and sounds. But something else was changing too, something quiet, something steady. Maya no longer watched the door every few minutes. She no longer flinched at unexpected sounds. And when Jonah moved past her in the narrow cabin, she didn't tense. Instead, she shifted just enough so their bodies brushed lightly, deliberately. By late afternoon, snowflakes began falling, slow, drifting flakes that melted on contact with the ground. Jonah stood outside, splitting wood, the rhythm familiar, grounding. Maya watched him through the window for a moment before stepping out to help gather the smaller pieces. You don't need to be out in the cold, Jonah said, lowering the axe. Maya balanced her daughter on her hip, her free hand tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. I want to be useful, she said, and I want to be near you. Jonah felt the words, more than he heard them. Simple, quiet, honest. He cleared his throat and gathered the split logs, stacking them carefully against the cabin wall. Maya bent to pick up the thinner branches, her movements still cautious but steady. Onya reached toward Jonah with her free hand, her fingers opening and closing. Maya smiled faintly. She likes you. Jonah took the small hand gently, letting the girl curl her fingers around his thumb. I like her too. The wind picked up slightly, bringing a sharper chill. Jonah motioned toward the cabin. Let's go in before the snow sticks. Inside, the warmth of the stove wrapped around them immediately. Maya set Onya on the bed with her wooden horse and moved to help Jonah hang his coat. When he reached up to place it on the hook, she stood close beside him, close enough for her shoulder to brush his arm. It wasn't accidental. Jonah lowered his hand slowly, turning toward her. Maya looked up at him, her breathing steady, her eyes clear in a way he hadn't seen before. You don't want us to leave, she said softly, not as a question, but as a realization. Jonah felt something settle deep in his chest. No, he said, I don't. Maya stepped closer. Her fingertips brushed lightly along the seam of his shirt, tracing the worn fabric before resting against his chest. Jonah lifted a hand and placed it gently at the back of her waist. Her eyes softened. I don't want to leave either. The words hung between them. Simple, final, chosen. Onya babbled quietly from the bed, a small sound that pulled both their gazes toward her. Maya smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. She's safe now, Maya said, for the first time in her life. Jonah looked at the child, then at Maya. So are you. A small breath trembled through her, not from fear, relief, pure relief. They moved back to the table, preparing a simple stew together. Jonah chopped vegetables while Maya stirred the pot, their movements falling into an easy rhythm. Their shoulders brushed occasionally, each touch quiet but meaningful, building a closeness that felt more real than any long speech. When supper was done, they ate together, Maya feeding Onya small bites while Jonah sat beside them, the soft glow of lamplight warming the room. After the meal, Jonah lifted the child and carried her to the bed. Onya rested against him without hesitation, her small head tucked under his chin. Maya watched, her chest rising in a slow, full breath. You look like you've done that before, she murmured. Jonah settled the child gently onto the blanket. I remember how, he said. Maya approached, standing close enough that their arms brushed faintly. You're good with her. Jonah met her eyes. I want her to feel safe here. I want you both to. Maya's hand rose to his face, slow, careful. Her fingertips traced the edge of his jaw, then paused at the faint scar near his cheekbone. Jonah didn't move, letting her study him without hurry. You protect this place, she said, and you protect us. I see that now. Jonah lifted his hand to her waist again, steady and warm. I protect what matters. Maya's breath caught. She leaned in until her forehead rested against his chest, her hands clutching the fabric of his shirt. Jonah wrapped an arm around her, not pulling her tightly, just holding her steady, giving her space to breathe, to feel safe, to exist without fear. I want to stay, she whispered. Not because we need shelter, but because being here with you feels right. Jonah closed his eyes briefly, feeling the truth settle deep inside him. Then stay. Maya tilted her head up, her face inches from his. Jonah brushed her cheek with his thumb, and she leaned into the touch. Their lips met again, slow, steady, sure. No hesitation this time, no uncertainty. It was a kiss shaped by choice, by quiet days spent together, by trust earned inch by inch. When they parted, Maya didn't step away. She rested her head beneath his chin, her arms around his waist, her breath warm against him. Outside, snow fell in soft, slow flakes. Inside, a small, unspoken family had already formed. And Jonah knew, without doubt, without fear, that he wanted them beside him for the rest of his days. Snow settled heavy across the valley by morning, smoothing the land into soft white mounds and muting every sound beyond the cabin walls. Jonah woke before sunrise, as he always did, but for the first time in years, he didn't rise in silence. Beside him, on a makeshift cot near the stove, Onya slept curled on her side, her breath gentle and even. And on the bed, not curled tight in fear, but resting on her back, Maya slept with one arm above her head, her dark hair spread across the pillow in loose waves. Her face looked softer, younger even, no longer pulled by constant fear or exhaustion. Jonah stood quietly, taking in a sight of them before lighting the stove. The warmth spread slowly through the cabin. The fire crackled in a steady, reassuring rhythm. This was his home, but it was no longer just his. A faint rustle behind him made him turn. Maya pushed herself upright, rubbing her eyes as the firelight warmed her face. "Morning," Jonas said, his voice low so as not to wake the child. Maya pulled the blanket around her shoulders. "You're always awake first." "Old habits," he replied. Maya stepped to the stove, her bare feet moving softly across the wood floor. She watched him stir the pot from last night, a simple breakfast warming inside. There was no hesitation between them now, no uncertainty in her expression. "How far does the snow reach?" she asked. "Up to the ridge," Jonas said. "Road's gone for a few days at least." Maya nodded, studying the falling flakes through the small window. "Then we're not going anywhere." She didn't say it with fear. She said it with comfort, with acceptance. Jonah felt something steady settle inside him, warm and sure. Onya woke with a soft noise, lifting her head from the blanket. Maya went to her immediately, lifting her into her arms and kissing her forehead. The child smiled, a real smile, bright and alive in a way Jonah hadn't seen before. Maya turned, her daughter on her hip. "She slept through the night." "First time since you came," Jonas said. Maya nodded, her eyes softening. "She feels safe." Jonah swallowed, the weight of the moment landing quietly but strongly inside his chest. "Good." They ate breakfast at the table, Jonah sitting beside Maya, Onya across his lap. Maya fed her daughter small spoonfuls while Jonah steadied the child when she reached too far or tried to climb. The closeness felt natural, earned solid. After the meal, they moved around the cabin together, cleaning, tending the fire, checking the windows. It wasn't spoken aloud, but both of them worked like people who intended to share a life, not a night. While Jonah repaired a loose drawer handle, Maya watched him with quiet reflection. She stepped closer, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Jonah," she said gently. He looked up, waiting. Maya held Onya close and exhaled. Her voice didn't shake. It carried certainty. "I don't want to leave when the snow melts. I don't want to go anywhere." Jonah put the drawer down, his heart pounding harder than he expected. "I don't want you to leave either." Maya took a small step forward. "I thought staying with someone would make me feel trapped again. But being here with you feels like breathing." Jonah's chest tightened, not in pain, but in something that felt almost like relief. "You and Onya belong here. If you choose it." "I do choose it," Maya said. No hesitation, no second guessing. Jonah looked at her daughter, who reached toward him with tiny fingers. He lifted her, and she settled easily against him like she had been doing it her whole life. Maya watched the two of them together, and her eyes filled, not with fear, but with the realization that she had finally found a place where running wasn't necessary. With slow steps, she moved toward Jonah. He shifted Onya to one arm, freeing his other to reach for Maya's waist. She stepped into him, resting her hand on his chest. "Jonah," she whispered, "if we stay, I want this to be a family, not just shelter." Jonah's hand tightened gently at her waist. "Maya, I already see you as family." Her breath trembled, but she didn't cry. She leaned forward and kissed him, slow and warm, a kiss that sealed the truth between them. Onya giggled softly in Jonah's arms, pressing her hand against his cheek as they kissed. They withdrew only slightly, foreheads touching, breath steady. Maya spoke softly. "I want you to be hers, Jonah, and for us to be yours." Jonah nodded once, deeply, without doubt. "You already are." The rest of the day unfolded simply. Steady chores, shared routine, quiet moments shaping something permanent. As the snow fell harder outside, Jonah brought an extra wood while Maya fixed the blanket seams, and Onya toddled around the cabin with her wooden horse. That evening, Jonah lit a second lantern, filling the room with a warm glow. Maya stood beside him, her hand in his. No vows were spoken, no formal ceremony held. In this quiet cabin, under the falling snow, the three of them stood together, choosing one another without hesitation. Jonah placed his hand gently on the back of Maya's head and pulled her close. She rested her forehead against his chest. Onya climbed onto Jonah's boot and held onto his pants, giggling. A family. Simple, steady, chosen. Jonah looked down and murmured, "This is home now, for all of us." Maya tightened her arms around him. Yes, home. Outside, snow blanketed the valley in quiet white. Inside, warmth filled every corner of the cabin. Not firelight alone, but the presence of three hearts finally allowed to rest. Their story ended not with fear or running, but with belonging, with safety, with love built through staying.